To understand the house, one must first understand the mechanism that paid for it. Before there was wood, there was steel. Before there was the endless labyrinth of hallways in San Jose, there was the cold, cylindrical finality of the .44 to 40 centerfire cartridge. We often look at the Winchester Mystery House as a ghost story, a localized haunting confined to a specific zip code in California, but this is a fundamental error in scope. The haunting did not begin on the West Coast. It began in the fires of the Industrial Revolution, inside the clamoring factories of New Haven, Connecticut. It began with a patent. It began with the industrialization of death. The Winchester Model 1873 was not merely a tool. It was a mythological object, christened the gun that won the West. But winning, in the context of empire and expansion, is a sanitized euphemism for erasure. It meant the systematic ballistic trauma inflicted upon indigenous populations, upon the buffalo that blackened the plains, upon the chaotic elements of a lawless frontier. Every pull of the lever, every ejection of spent brass, every cloud of sulfurous smoke was a transaction. A life was subtracted from the physical world, and a fraction of gold was added to the bank accounts of the Winchester family. It is here, in this bloody arithmetic, that our protagonist, Sarah Lockwood Pardee, found herself entrapped. She was not a soldier. She was not a general. She was a woman of diminutive stature, barely 4 feet 10 inches tall, possessed of a brilliant mind and a musical soul. Yet she sat at the delta of a river of blood money that flowed backward from the violent frontiers directly into her parlor. Sarah was born in 1839 into the velvet-draped comfort of the upper class. She was known as the Belle of New Haven, a title that implies a certain fragility and ornamental purpose. Yet she was intellectually formidable, fluent in 4 languages, a student of the classics, and a pianist of immense talent. When she married William Wirt Winchester in 1862, it was viewed by society as a dynastic merging of beauty and industry, the perfect Victorian union. But consider the date, 1862. The United States was tearing itself apart in the Civil War, while Sarah and William were establishing their domestic empire. The rifles bearing their name were being used to turn men into meat on the battlefields of Antietam and Gettysburg. The fortune that cushioned their lives was being generated by the very machinery that was widowing thousands of other women across the continent. There is a metaphysical weight to such money. It is heavy. It carries the ionization of violence. One must wonder if Sarah, sensitive and perceptive, felt the vibration of this carnage in the silver spoons she held, or in the silk of the dresses she wore. Did the walls of their New Haven home hum with the distant screams of the dying? This is not a poetic flourish. It is a question of moral thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred. And the kinetic energy of millions of bullets had to go somewhere. The universe, in its cruel and detached irony, often demands a tax on such excessive fortune, a levy paid not in currency, but in biological tragedy. The first collection of this debt occurred on July 25, 1866. Sarah gave birth to a daughter, Annie Pardee Winchester. For a brief luminous moment, the darkness of the war and the industrial grime of the business were pushed back by the pristine light of new life. But Annie was not long for this world. She was struck by a condition known then as The word itself is horrific, derived from the Greek marasmus, meaning decay. In modern medical parlance, we would call it severe protein-calorie malnutrition, a metabolic failure where the body, unable to process nutrients, begins to consume itself. It is a slow, agonizing wasting away. Imagine the physiological horror of a mother watching her infant shrink day by day, the skin becoming loose and translucent, the eyes sinking into the skull, staring out with a haunting, ancient wisdom that no child should possess. The silence of the nursery becomes a physical weight, heavier than lead. Sarah watched the light fade from her daughter's eyes, holding a child who was quite literally evaporating in her arms. When Annie died, 40 days after her birth, something in Sarah's mind fractured. It was a clean break, a snap in the psyche that would never fully heal. She fell into a Catatonic depression, a shadow realm where she hovered for nearly a decade. She retreated into herself. The belle of New Haven, replaced by a ghost in mourning weeds, drifting through rooms that felt too large, too quiet, too empty. But the fates were not finished with the House of Winchester. The mechanism of tragedy had only fired its first chamber. In 1881, the second blow landed. Her husband, William, the heir to the rifle empire, fell ill. It was not a sudden accident, but another slow, consuming horror. Tuberculosis, the White Plague. In the 19th century, consumption was the romanticized reaper, but the reality was visceral and terrifying. It is a bacterial invasion of the lungs, a colonization of the breath. Watch as the vibrant, powerful industrialist is reduced to a feverish, coughing skeleton. The sound of the consumptive cough is distinctive wet, rattling, a sound of drowning on dry land. For weeks, Sarah sat by his bedside, the smell of sickness permeating the heavy curtains, the metallic scent of blood on handkerchiefs, mixing with the medicinal odors of camphor and laudanum. She watched the man she loved, the anchor of her reality, disintegrate. When he died, Sarah was 41 years old. In the span of 15 years, the two pillars of her existence, the future represented by her child and the present represented by her husband, were pulverized. She was left entirely alone. But she was not just alone. She was arguably one of the wealthiest women in the world. She inherited a 50% stake in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Her inheritance was $20 million. In today's currency, that is over $500 million. Her daily income, passive, relentless, unstoppable, was $1,000 a day. Roughly $30,000 every 24 hours. Even while she slept, the factories pumped out rifles. The rifles pumped out bullets. The bullets killed men, and the profits flowed into her accounts. But money, she would soon learn, is not an insulator against the metaphysical. It is a conductor. It acts as an antenna. Sarah began to feel that she was not merely grieving, but that she was being hunted. The sheer magnitude of her loss could not be explained by bad luck. It felt targeted. It felt judicial. In the depths of her despair, Sarah sought answers where the rational world offered none. She turned to spiritualism. We must contextually understand this movement. In the wake of the Civil War, America was a nation of mourners. Almost everyone had lost someone. The veil between the living and the dead felt thin, porous, torn by the sheer volume of souls passing through it. Spiritualism was not a fringe cult. It was a desperate coping mechanism for a traumatized populace. It was in this atmosphere of dimly lit parlors, floating trumpets, and automatic writing that Sarah sought a consultation. Legend tells us she traveled to Boston to meet a medium, a conduit to the other side. Whether this person was a charlatan preying on a wealthy widow, or a genuine sensitive picking up on Sarah's psychic distress, is irrelevant. The outcome was the same. The diagnosis was delivered with the weight of a Supreme Court verdict. The medium told her what she had already begun to suspect in the darkest corners of her insomnia. The family was cursed. The spirits of those killed by the Winchester rifle, the Confederate soldiers, the Union conscripts, the Native American warriors, the victims of frontier shootouts were seeking vengeance. Blood calls to blood. They had taken her daughter. They had taken her husband. And now, they were coming for her. The logic was terrifyingly simple. You cannot profit from death on an industrial scale without incurring a spiritual debt. The bill had come due. But the medium offered a loophole, a bizarre clause in the contract of the damned. To appease these angry spirits, to confuse them, to keep them at bay, she had to go west, the medium reportedly said. Build a house. But not just a home. You must build a structure that never ceases. As long as the hammers ring, you will live. As long as the saws cut, the demons are kept at bay. Stop, and you die. Consider the psychology of this command. It weaponized Sarah's grief and turned it into a construction project. It gave her a task. It gave her agency in a world where she had been helpless. She packed her trunks. She shrouded her face in a heavy, dark veil that she would rarely lift for the Rest of her life, a physical barrier between her and the world of the living. She boarded the train for California, leaving behind the gray skies of New Haven for the Santa Clara Valley. But she wasn't just moving, she was fleeing. She was a fugitive, running from an army of ghosts that only she could see, carrying a war chest of blood money to fund her defense. Imagine that train ride across the continent. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks, clack 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 clack, sounding suspiciously like the racking of a lever-action rifle. Looking out the window as the lush green of the east gave way to the flat plains and eventually the golden dusty hills of the west. Every mile she traveled was a mile through the graveyard her family's weapons had helped create. She was traveling through the crime scene to build her sanctuary. She arrived in San Jose in 1884. It was a different world than agricultural, open, smelling of apricots and drying hay. She found an unfinished, 8-room farmhouse on 161 acres of land. It was modest, it was simple, it was the seed. When she signed the deed, she wasn't just buying property, she was buying a canvas for her madness. She hired carpenters, she hired masons, she hired gardeners, and she gave the order that would define the rest of her life: start working, and don't stop. Not ever. This is the moment the atmosphere shifted. The silence of the farmhouse was replaced by a cacophony that would last for 38 years. The sound of the hammer striking the nail became the heartbeat of the estate. But this was not normal construction. There were no blueprints. There was no master architect sitting in a drafting room planning the flow of the foyer into the parlor. There was only Sarah. Sarah, small and veiled, suffering from crippling rheumatoid arthritis that twisted her hands and feet, walking the grounds like a wraith. She would sketch on napkins. She would draw on the back of envelopes. She would point a trembling finger at a wall and say, "Add a room here, put a window there, build a staircase here," and the men built. They were paid. Well, doubled the going rate, so they didn't ask questions. If the widow wanted a staircase that led directly into a solid ceiling, they built it. If she wanted a chimney that stopped a foot short of the roof, rendering it useless, they built it. If she wanted a door on the second floor that opened into thin air, a sheer drop to the garden below, they hung the frame and polished the knob. The house began to metastasize. It grew like a biological organism, like a tumor made of redwood and stained glass. It spread outward, consuming the garden. It spread upward, consuming the sky. It wasn't architecture. It was accretion. It was a physical manifestation of a mind trying to outrun a haunting through the sheer complexity of space. The why of these oddities is where the story descends into the true deep dive. Standard tours will tell you she was just crazy, but look closer. Look at the staircase to nowhere. It is not just a mistake. It is a tactical maneuver against the supernatural. The law of the time suggested that spirits, while able to pass through walls, were confused by complex geometry. They could be trapped in loops. A ghost ascending a staircase expects to reach a landing. If it hits a ceiling, it is baffled, stalled. Sarah was building a spirit trap. She was creating a labyrinth to confuse the entities that whispered in her ears. At night, she was trying to hack the code of the afterlife, using carpentry as her programming language. Let us pause and consider the sensory experience of living in this construction site. For 38 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the noise never ceased. Shifts of workers rotated in and out. The banging, the sawing, the shouting. Most people would go insane from the noise alone. For Sarah, the noise was the only thing that kept her sane. The silence was the enemy. Silence was the vacuum into which the spirits poured. The industrial clamor was a shield, a wall of sound that drowned out the memories of her daughter's gasping breath and her husband's rattling cough. But beneath the noise, there was a profound, suffocating loneliness. Sarah withdrew from society completely. She was the witch of San Jose, the eccentric widow, the mystery. She had no visitors, she had no friends. Her only companions were the servants, the workmen, and the invisible legion she was trying to appease. She began to sleep in a different room every night. She would rotate through the house, never settling, a moving target. Imagine the paranoia required to live like that in your own home. To be a refugee in your own palace. To lie awake in a strange bed, in a room you just had built yesterday, listening to the wind rattle, the windows that might look into another room, or into a wall, or into the void, and wondering if they had found you yet. The house was not just a defense, it was a confession. It was a monument to guilt. Every Tiffany stained glass window, some costing vast fortunes. Designed with spiderwebs, and the repetition of the number 13 was a penance. She was beautifying her prison. She was trying to buy forgiveness with aesthetic perfection. The number 13 became a recurring motif, a compulsive sigil woven into the fabric of the building. 13 bathrooms. Windows with 13 panes. 13 hooks in the seance room, modified to hold 13 candles. Was this an attempt to reclaim the number from its unlucky associations, or was it a surrender to the dark logic of the curse? Was she marking the house, branding it, signaling to the other side that she understood the rules of the game? By the turn of the century, the house had reached a monstrous proportion. It towered 7 stories high. It was a babel of turrets, cupolas, and spires, a chaotic skyline that loomed over the orderly orchards of San Jose. Was a sore thumb. It was a scream in wood. And the earth itself seemed to take notice. The ground beneath California is not stable. It is restless, much like Sarah's soul. And in 1906, the tectonic plates decided to intervene in the Widows Project. But that cataclysm, and the devastation it brought, belongs to the next chapter of this descent. For now, we leave Sarah in the late 19th century, standing in the center of her growing labyrinth, the smell of sawdust and sawdust in the air, the sound of hammers ringing like church bells, a tiny figure in black holding the line against the encroaching dark. She has built the trap, but she does not yet know that she is the one caught inside it. Part 2. The Tectonic Judgment and the Inward Turn. By the spring of 1906, the Winchester House was no longer merely a residence. It was a citadel of superstition that scraped the California sky. It had risen to a dizzying height of 7 stories, a chaotic babel of turrets, cupolas, and spires that loomed over the Santa Clara Valley like a wooden thunderhead. It was a testament to the limitless power of fear funded by an unlimited budget. But the geology of California is indifferent to human wealth, and it is certainly indifferent to the architectural appeasement of spirits. The earth beneath the Santa Cruz Mountains operates on a timeline of tension and release that predates the invention of the rifle by eons. On the morning of April 18, 1906, at 5:12 a.m., the San Andreas Fault unzipped. The violence of the rupture was biblical. The energy release was equivalent to millions of tons of TNT detonating beneath the crust. In San Francisco, the city was turning into a furnace. But in San Jose, the violence was kinetic. The ground did not just shake, it rolled. It underwent liquefaction, turning solid soil into a roiling fluid. Inside the mansion, the sensation must have been apocalyptic. The massive redwood timbers, seasoned and heavy, groaned under the torsion. The specialized floating foundation, which Sarah had arguably designed with some foresight, saved the main structure from total obliteration. But the 7-story tower, the crown jewel of her obsession, did not survive. It snapped. With a sound that must have rivaled the artillery fire of the Civil War, the upper floors disintegrated, collapsing inward and downward, raining brick and splintered wood into the gardens below. The house was screaming. Inside the Daisy Room, located in the front section of the house, Sarah Winchester was asleep. The violence of the quake jammed the doorframe, sealing her inside. For hours, the woman worth $20 million, the matriarch of the gun empire, was trapped in the dark, choking on plaster dust, buried alive in the belly of the beast she had fed for decades. Imagine the terror of that confinement. In the pitch blackness, with the aftershocks rolling through the floorboards like waves on a wooden ocean, she did not pray to the Christian God for rescue. She likely believed the spirits had finally breached the perimeter. She believed the hammering had failed. When her servants finally pried the door open with crowbars and dug her out, Sarah was shaken but physically unharmed. Her interpretation of the event, however, was not geological, it was theological. A rational mind sees plate tectonics, a haunted mind sees divine wrath. She looked at the ruined tower, the shattered windows, and the cracked plaster, and she did not see structural failure. She saw a message. The spirits were angry. But why? Her logic, twisted by years of isolation and guilt, arrived at a specific conclusion. Vanity. She had spent too much time, too much effort, and too much money beautifying the front of the house. She had tried to make it a grand estate for the eyes of the living, rather than a functional machine for the appeasement of the dead. She had succumbed to pride. The earthquake was a corrective measure, a slap from the other side to remind her of her true purpose. Her response was immediate and drastic. She did not repair the damage to the front of the house. She ordered the workmen to board it up. The grand front doors, which had cost a fortune and were meant to welcome dignitaries who never came, were sealed. They would never be opened again in her lifetime. She turned the houses back to the street. The unfinished rooms were left as open wounds, exposed to the elements or hastily patched. She retreated deeper into the interior. If the spirits were angry about the facade, she would focus entirely on the guts of the building. The construction resumed, but the energy had curdled. It was no longer about expansion. It was about complication. The house became hermetic, an introverted puzzle box designed to disorient anything that entered, be it human or spectre. This is where the architecture begins to mirror the profound physical suffering of its creator. We often focus on the madness of the designs, the stairs to nowhere, the doors, opening to walls as evidence of insanity. But we must layer in the physiological reality of Sarah's existence. By this time, her rheumatoid arthritis was savage. It was a calcifying fire in her joints. Her hands were gnarled claws. Her knees were rusted hinges of bone on bone. Every step was an agony. This pain dictated the design of the famous switchback staircase. To the casual observer, it is a bizarre architectural joke. A staircase with 7 flights and 44 steps that only rises 9 feet in total elevation. Each step is merely 2 inches high. Tours will tell you this was to confuse the ghosts, to make them stumble. But look at it through the lens of pain. These were easy rises. Sarah could not lift her feet more than a few inches without excruciating pain. She built a staircase that shuffled, just like she did. The house was adapting to her disability. She was encasing herself in a prosthetic shell of mahogany and teak. Yet the dual purpose remains. Was it for her knees, or was it for the ghosts? In Sarah's mind, the distinction had likely evaporated. She was the ghost. She was the haunting. She moved through the house in a blur of dark silk, a tiny figure navigating a wooden nervous system. She installed 3 elevator Zodus electric models, rare luxury for the time being, because the stairs, even the easy ones, eventually became too much. One of these elevators was powered by a specialized, expensive hydraulic piston system. Why? Because the electric elevator made a noise that she found intolerable. She needed silence in her movement. She needed to drift. It was in this post-earthquake era that the obsession with the Blue Room solidified. This was the epicenter of the house, the seance room. It was a space of absolute control. Only Sarah had the key. The servants were forbidden to enter. It was here, every night, as the clock struck midnight, that the ritual took place. The room is acoustically peculiar, likely by design. It concentrates sound in certain pockets while swallowing it in others. Sarah would enter, locking the door behind her, a door that, if you believe the reports, she would sometimes exit by walking through a wall, or, rather, a hidden panel that allowed her to vanish from the room without opening the main entrance. Inside, she wore one of 13 special colored robes. She would sit at a table, surrounded by the silence she had purchased at such a high cost, and wait. For what? Instructions. The blueprints for the next day's work were not drawn by architects. They were allegedly dictated by the spirits in this room. Build a cupola here. Tear down that wall. Seal off that room. The randomness of the construction was not random. It was a transcription of chaos. She was writing a novel where the words were rooms and the punctuation marks were windows. Some theorized she was using a planchette, a Ouija board, or automatic writing. Others suggest she simply sat in the dark, listening to the house settle, interpreting the creaks and groans of the timber as voices from the grave. Sarah, ... The wood would groan as the temperature dropped. Sarah, ... double quotes, the wind would whistle through the unsealed eaves. In this room, there were no mirrors. Mirrors were forbidden. The law suggests that spirits despise their own reflection, or perhaps that mirrors act as portals that can be used by the dead to enter the world of the living uninvited. Or, perhaps more tragically, Sarah simply could not bear to look at herself. She could not bear to see the aging, pain-racked woman who had outlived her child and her husband. The woman who was spending a fortune to build a mausoleum for a life she wasn't living. The Blue Room was a space of projection, not reflection. It was during these years that the most nonsensical features were installed, features that suggest a mind trying to trap smoke. The door to nowhere on the second floor, which opens to a sheer drop to the garden, is often cited as a trap for ghosts. If a spirit walked through, it would fall. But spirits can fly, can they not? Or was the trap for something else? Was it a constant, subconscious temptation for Sarah herself? A quick way out of the pain. We see the witch's cap, a conical ceiling that acts as a perfect echo chamber. If you stand in the center and speak, the sound reverberates directly back into your own skull. Was she trying to amplify the whispers? The workforce became her congregation. At its peak, she had nearly 20 servants and a rotating army of carpenters and gardeners. They lived on the estate. They raised their families in the shadow of the constant hammering. They saw her rarely, a dark shape in a carriage, or a face in a window, quickly turning away. They were paid well to accept the madness. The gardener knew to keep the hedges trimmed, but never to question why a cypress tree was planted in the middle of a pathway. The painter knew to paint a room and then, a week later, paint over it with a different color, and then board the room up entirely. It was an economy of absurdity. The logic of capitalism, efficiency, utility, profit, was inverted. The goal was inefficiency. The goal was waste, because waste meant time, and time was the only currency Sarah cared about. She was buying minutes of life with hours of labor. This brings us to a critical interrogation of the human condition, one that I want you to consider deeply. We look at Sarah Winchester, and we see a crazy woman, but is she so different from the modern condition? We build our own fortresses. We surround ourselves with noise, digital noise, social media scrolling, the ceaseless stream of content to drown out the silence where our own ghosts live. We buy things we don't need to fill voids that cannot be filled. We renovate our lives, changing the facade, hoping that if we change the outside enough, the inside will stop hurting. I want you to pause and ask yourself, do you believe that an environment can drive a person mad, or does a mad person infect their environment? Was the house a product of Sarah's delusion, or did the isolation of the house create the delusion? And more importantly, do objects retain the energy of their history? Can a rifle, or a house, be truly cursed? Or is the curse entirely in the mind of the beholder? Leave your analysis in the comments below. I read the darkness, you're right. As the years ground on toward the 1920s, the house began to feel less like a construction site and more like a living organism that was slowly dying. The paint on the older sections was peeling. The unsealed rooms were gathering dust. The labyrinth was becoming choked with its own complexity. Sarah was growing frailer. Her eyesight was failing. The arthritis had curled her body into a question mark. But still, she listened. Still, she sketched. The fear had not abated. It had merely ossified. It had become the bone structure of her life. She was no longer running. She was enduring. She was waiting. For the one visitor she couldn't build a wall to keep out. The one visitor who doesn't need a door. And in the deep silence of the Blue Room, amidst the smell of velvet and old wood, one has to wonder if she finally realized the ultimate tragedy of her project. You cannot confuse death. You can only delay it. And the bill, eventually, must be paid in full. Part 3. The sudden silence and the architecture of entropy. On the morning of September 5, 1922, the sun rose over the Santa Clara Valley, with the same hazy, golden indifference it had shown for millennia. The orchards were heavy with fruit. The air was thick with the scent of late summer dust and drying grass. Inside the sprawling, wooden exoskeleton of the Winchester mansion, the routine began, as it always did. The servants moved through the labyrinthine corridors with the silent efficiency of blood cells navigating a vein. The kitchen staff stoked the fires. The gardeners sharpened their shears. And the carpenters, the legion of men who had aged alongside the house, picked up their hammers. The rhythmic industrial heartbeat of the estate began its daily throb. Bang, bang. It was the pulse of survival. It was the sound that meant the mistress was still alive. Until, abruptly, it wasn't. At some point in the early hours, in a bedroom that was likely chosen at random to confuse the spirits, the biological machinery of Sarah Lockwood, Party Winchester, finally ground to a halt. There was no dramatic climax. There was no swirling vortex of ghosts dragging her into the abyss. There was simply the failure of the heart. A muscle worn out by 82 years of pumping blood through a body rigid with pain and a mind besieged by anxiety. She died in her sleep. The mainspring of the Winchester house broke. When the news traveled from the bedroom to the foreman, and from the foreman to the work crews, the effect was instantaneous and jarring. We must visualize this moment with forensic clarity. For 38 years, the air around this property had been solid with noise. The sound of construction was a physical presence, a constant pressure on the eardrums. And then, in 1 second, it evaporated. The hammers stopped mid-swing. The saws were pulled back from the timber, leaving jagged, unfinished cuts. The nails were left half-driven into the redwood, protruding like metal stubble. The silence that rushed in to fill the void must have been deafening. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a vacuum. It was the shock of a chaotic system suddenly losing its energy source. The workers, some of whom had spent their entire adult lives building rooms that would never be used, put down their tools, wiped the sweat from their brows, and walked off the job. They knew the money had stopped. The spell was broken. They left the house exactly as it was, a sentence interrupted in the middle of a word. The aftermath of her death revealed the true extent of her isolation and the pathetic nature of her treasure. Sarah had left everything to her niece, Marian. The world, hungry for a scandal and obsessed with the legend of the eccentric billionaire widow, waited with bated breath for the opening of the safes. There were multiple safes scattered throughout the house, hidden behind panels, tucked into cupboards. The expectation was that they contained bars of gold, piles of cash, perhaps the deeds to half of Connecticut. They cracked them open, the heavy steel doors swinging wide to reveal ... nothing. Or rather, nothing of value to a bank. They found locks of hair, her daughter's, her husband's, preserved like holy relics. They found woolen underwear, stockpiled against the cold she always felt. They found stacks of obituaries and newspapers discussing the deaths of people she loved. This was her hoard. She wasn't guarding gold, she was guarding grief. She had built a fortress to protect the ephemera of memory. It was a heartbreaking revelation that the mystery of the house was not supernatural greed, but a profound, unmanaged hoarding of trauma. The dissolution of the estate was rapid and ruthless. The furniture, the Tiffany glass that had never been installed, the miles of silk, the pipe organ set, was all auctioned off. It took 6 weeks to empty the house. Movers navigated the twisting hallways, stripping the flesh from the bones of the mansion. Once the contents were gone, the house itself was sold. It went for a pittance, roughly $135,000, a fraction of the millions Sarah had poured into it. The land was subdivided. The house was left as a hollow shell, a wooden carcass, stripped of its spirit. But capitalism, much like the ghosts Sarah feared, is a force that recycles everything. The house was almost immediately turned into a tourist attraction. This is the final dark irony of the Winchester legacy. Sarah built the house to keep people and spirits out. She designed it to be impenetrable, Confusing, a place of solitude. Today, millions of tourists pay to walk through her bedroom. They stomp through the holes she crept through. They take flash photographs in the seance room where she sought silence. The house has become exactly what she hated, a spectacle. The Mystery House is now a brand, a logo on a keychain, a backdrop for selfies. We have commodified her madness. We have turned her tragedy into an amusement park. When you walk through those halls, listening to the scripted jokes of the tour guides about the crazy lady and her goofy stares, you are participating in the final violation of her privacy. You are the haunting she was afraid of. But let us step back and look at the structure one last time, not as a tourist attraction, but as a philosophical artifact. The Winchester Mystery House is the perfect architectural representation of the American condition. It is built on a foundation of gun violence. It is funded by the industrial military complex. It is shaped by spiritual paranoia and religious guilt. And it is driven by the relentless, manic need to expand, to build bigger, to keep moving, to never stop. It is a house that consumes resources to produce nothing but confusion. Is that not the story of the 20th century? Sarah Winchester tried to build a wall between herself and the consequences of her family's legacy. She tried to use architecture to solve a moral problem. She failed. The rifle is still famous. The ghosts, if they exist, are still there, likely more confused by the tourists than they ever were by the staircases. The lesson of the Winchester House is that you cannot build your way out of guilt. You cannot construct a labyrinth complex enough to lose your own shadow. The past is not a ghost that walks through walls. The past is the wall. It is the floor, it is the ceiling. We live inside our history, and no amount of carpentry can change that. The house stands today in San Jose, surrounded by strip malls and movie theaters, a relic of a darker, stranger time. It is a scar on the landscape, a beautiful, intricate, multi-million-dollar scar. If you stand in the garden at twilight, when the tourists have gone and the lights of the gift shop dim, you might still hear it. Not the sound of hammers, but the sound of a breath held for too long. The sound of a woman waiting for a forgiveness that never arrived. The architecture of fear is not limited to California. There are other places where the geometry of the room feels wrong, where the shadows detach themselves from the objects that cast them. If you have the stomach to explore another location where the walls have absorbed the madness of their inhabitants, where the line between the living and the dead is erased by stone and mortar, click the video appearing on your screen now. We are leaving the wooden labyrinth of San Jose for a colder, harder place. The journey into the dark is not over. It has only just begun.